Okay, I am not here today, so I am doing this through video. These are the early battles of the Civil War, which is America's bloodiest. That's what this chart is showing, that there were over 620,000 American casualties in the Civil War, which puts it head and shoulders above every other war that America has ever taken part in. The other close one is World War II, having 400,000 casualties. In fact, when the American Civil War occurred, there were more casualties in that war than all previous wars combined. And if you excluded World War II, there would still be more casualties in the American Civil War than every other war except World War II combined. There are a number of reasons for why there are so many casualties to the American Civil War. First, you have to consider the fact that everyone was an American, North or South, no matter if the battle was won or lost, whoever was killed was an American, so those numbers tend to add up pretty quickly. Also, a major contributing factor to the Civil War was that there was very poor medical technology. For people who were wounded, they had a very great chance of not surviving being injured, and high rates of infection and poor treatments of injuries basically resulted in more deaths during the war. There was a nickname for doctors during the Civil War, and that was a sawbones. And that's not just a cute way of describing a doctor, that was literally a description of the treatment. There were a number of cases where if someone was injured in, say, an arm, if you were hit in the arm with a bullet, the doctor would literally tie it off with the tourniquet and saw off the bone, amputate it, saw off your arm to stop the spread of infection. Keep in mind there was no antibiotic, not a lot of antiseptic. This idea that you should wear gloves was a developing idea that few people had any idea about infection and how that was handled. There were nearly as many people dying from infection than there were being shot on the battlefield. And this really contributed to the deaths during the Civil War. And the third, and probably the most prominent reason, meaning the most important reason for the casualties of the American Civil War, was the idea that they were fighting with very outdated tactics. The weapons between the Mexican-American War and the American Civil War had undergone a revolution of change. However, the tactics that they used to fight these wars had not changed, and this proved to be absolutely fatal in numerous battles. Let's look a little deeper into the technology that improved leading into this war and how they were still using very outdated tactics to fight the war. This was a pretty typical scene during the Napoleonic Wars, or if you've ever seen video of the American Revolution, the British Redcoats fought in a very similar pattern where they stand shoulder to shoulder and basically in these huge firing squads open fire. I've heard a number of people say that this means of fighting is ridiculous, and it actually was come time for the Civil War. However, in previous wars, the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the Revolutionary Wars in the United States, this means of fighting actually made sense. The idea was that weapons were highly inaccurate. If you think back to when I did my Andrew Jackson duel with the pistols, and I said that it's very likely from 30 paces the pistols will not hit one another, that same idea can be applied to battlefields. You know, muskets, while shoulder mounted, could shoot farther than a pistol. They still would tumble and travel all over the place, and there was a very bad chance that if you aimed at somebody, more than 30 feet away from you, that you would miss them. And the idea of lining up shoulder to shoulder like this was the idea that you would have concentrated firepower. So you're not really aiming at an individual person when you shot these muskets. You were trying to create a wall of steel that you would hurl at the enemy and mow them down. And if the enemy was scattered, their wall of steel would be less accurate, and so your wall of steel and well-organized, tight-knit ranks like this would be better. You would also notice that they have these large bayonets on the end of each of their muskets. The bayonet was nearly as fatal in the Napoleonic warfares as the guns themselves. What would happen is you would fire when you're at range, maybe 2 or 3 shots, depending on how quickly you could reload. And then after the second or third shot, you'd be so close that it would be quicker to charge the enemy and start stabbing them with the knives at the base of your rifle than you were to actually shoot them. And so that's another thing that contributed to these tactics. Not only were these guns highly inaccurate, but it would take seconds to reload. There was a very intricate process where you would fire your little pellet, this little lead ball, and then to reload, you would have to clean the chamber, you'd have to pour gunpowder, you would have to load this wad of like cotton, and then you would put a charge at the back, you would drop the ball, the little lead shot in, and then you would fire, and that process was not quick. So that contributed more to the, bayonettings and the short distances that the battles were fought in the Napoleonic Wars and the Revolutionary War as well. But when the Civil War came along, we were no longer fighting with the same guns they were using in Napoleonic France. The weapons had come light years from then, and they really hadn't had a war to test these weapons and the tactics that they were using. Many historians describe the Civil War as being the first modern war. I don't use that term for the Civil War. I think the first true modern war would be World War I, because in that war you start having motorized vehicles and you have airplanes. But in the Civil War, they did rapidly take steps towards modern war. The first improvement in the weapons was the improved range of our firearms. They had crafted a mini ball, which is a device somewhat shaped like a bullet in the bullet shape. It's not technically a bullet. A bullet carries its own charge and its own cartridge. Basically, a bullet can fire by itself. Muskets can't do that. Mini balls don't shoot by themselves, but they have that sort of bullet shape that we've come to recognize. Furthermore, the weapons of the time also started to rifle the barrels. Basically, there were grooves in the barrel that caused the mini ball to spin as it is fired on itself. If you ever observe somebody who's really good at throwing a football, it takes some technique, because you don't just chuck the ball in the air. You kind of make a downward snapping motion. You try to keep your wrist lock, and you try to throw it with a spiral. And that was something it took me forever as a kid to learn how to throw a spiral football. And when I finally got it, it was like a big accomplishment for me. But the idea is, by spiraling the ball, it controls it from tumbling around, and it actually makes your passing more accurate. Same thing with these rifling of the barrels. By spinning the mini ball on itself, it made it more accurate over distance. And as a result of these two advancements, the mini ball and the rifle barreled, it moved the effective range of most weapons from 100 yards to 400 yards, which means it literally quadrupled the distance that you could kill other people from accurately. There were some shots in the Civil War that happened close to 1,000 yards, which is completely remarkable and something you could not have achieved during the Napoleonic Wars. Also, not only did the range of the weapons quadruple, but the ability to fire quickly also drastically increased as well. They had created these rear-loading carbines, which took a step away. All you'd have to do is put in a cartridge from the rear of the rifle, which made for a quicker reload of these muskets. And then in some cases, they had even advanced the revolver, which is a typical sort of pistol that you may have seen, maybe in like westerns or that sort of thing, that has 6 shots, and basically you could fire 6 shots in rapid succession without reloading. And that's almost, today we view that as an outdated technology. We have semi-automatic weapons and automatic weapons. But in the Civil War, this was a new technology, the revolver, the repeating carbine, combined with the range. So what this meant was, in the past, you'd start shooting people from, maybe 100 yards, think the distance of a football field, and you would get 2 or 3 shots, and then you'd go to bayonets, okay? If you were 100 yards from the enemy in the Civil War, you just got shot several times on the way there. You are well beyond the effective range, and you're getting killed. And if you were trying to charge, you're having to charge 4 times the distance. It's a completely new game. So this is just an illustration. This is like a Colt revolver. Now, not every soldier carried a Colt revolver. This is more of an officer weapon. He might carry it with a saber. So basically, he'd ride on horseback, and with one hand, he'd have a big sword, basically, and the other hand, he would have the pistol, which would allow him to kill multiple people at once. This is a Civil War era mini ball. If you see these little grooves cut in it, that is to help with the rifling. And this is a Sharps carbine rifle that could rear load. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that the Sharps rifle had actually been used in a previous violent time. Does anybody recall what the Sharps rifle was referred to during Bleeding Kansas? Anyone remember what they called the Sharps rifle during Bleeding Kansas? Bueller? Anybody? I'm sure by now somebody has said that they were called Bibles or Beecher Bibles because these guns were used in Bleeding Kansas as well. Good job, whoever that was. Not only were our personal weapons improved, but also the cannonball had come a long way. Previously, cannonballs were like a solid piece of metal, like a shot put, and this big charge would shoot them, and they'd kind of hit one target in a straight line and like bounce around and cause damage. By the time the Civil War had come, artillery had increased in range as well, partially because of the rifling of the artillery barrels, but also they had this explosive effect. This is known as grape shot. So it wasn't just a solid steel ball that was being fired, it was this steel ball that was filled with a charge that would explode, and then it would hit all these pellets out in all sort of directions, sort of grenade style. And this drastically increased the lethality of artillery. And it was another reason why it was very stupid to stand in really big groups, because this artillery shell hit the middle of you, and everybody for 15, 20 feet is getting hit by a lead pellet and being killed. So the artillery shell also sort of changed the game. Further on in the war, there was another increase of rapidity of fire. That means like how quickly you can shoot bullets, rate of fire, so to speak. And this would be the development of the Gatling gun. Gatling guns weren't commonly used in the Civil War. This was cutting-edge technology at the end of the war. And a Gatling gun has this series of barrels that turns individually on this crank. So basically it had like a hammer that would hit each of these barrels, and it could be belt fed, and it just like fed, and as the faster you cranked this, the more bullets it would shoot. And this was essentially a very early age machine gun. Now when World War I comes along, they have full-blown machine guns that are, you don't have to crank. They're basically, self-powering. One shot reloads the chamber and puts in another round. But the Gatling gun was cutting-edge Civil War technology, not widely used, but it is a good example of how rapid fire was becoming more common. Somebody might ask, why wasn't the Gatling gun commonly used? A lot of people didn't trust it. They were prone to backfire. Also, they were expensive and a new technology that not everyone had. So that's why the Gatling gun wasn't commonly used. It just wasn't something that was available for everybody. Had the war went on for a few more years, I imagine the Gatling gun may have become more popular. Okay, so we've already talked about how warfare changed through weapons. However, they were still standing in big groups and just waiting to get mowed down, and that was a huge mistake. Now let's talk about some of the early battles and how they took place. Many of the early Civil War battles, in fact, many battles in the war, are fought in the state of Virginia. Virginia is essentially right next door to Washington, D.C. When Virginia seceded from the Union, it was a major loss to the entire country. There's a lot of history of the United States that goes back to the state of Virginia. You know, George Washington, for Pete's sakes, was born in Virginia. Washington and Jefferson, it was one of the biggest of the original 13 states, and it was a significantly large state. It was highly populated. It's literally next door to Washington, D.C. There's a river that divides Washington, which is his own territory from Virginia, and Virginia's right there. And with the loss of Virginia, the Union also lost its most capable military general, which was Robert E. Lee, who will go on to become this hero of the Confederacy and often considered one of the best military minds of all history. And had his state, Virginia, stayed part of the Union, the war could have turned out much differently. However, he, military mastermind, said that he could not fight against his fellow Virginian and left when his state left. If you think back to last notes, there were two waves of secession. The first were states further south that seceded. Which state seceded first, do you think? Waiting. The question was, which state seceded first? And that state would be South Carolina, of course. South Carolina was the one that's been threatening to leave ever since the nullification crisis. So that's not a big shock. But the loss of Virginia was a big shock because it's right next to D.C. It has lots of history, and we lost our most capable leader, Robert E. Lee. This is an illustration of downtown Washington, D.C. You note that here's the White House, right? The Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, which obviously did not exist then, and all these, important buildings of our nation's capital. And you see that this is the Potomac, and across from the Potomac is essentially Virginia. Okay, and that's how close it is. There's literally one river that separates our capital from Virginia. In fact, Robert E. Lee's mansion was right here. It's called the Lee Custis Mansion. His wife's family was Custis. He had married into it, and that was Lee's property. And people back in the day liked to have fancy names for their property. Thomas Jefferson's home was called Monticello. Jackson's home was known as the Hermitage, and Lee's family estate was called Arlington. Has anyone heard of Arlington before? Anyone? Anyone been to Arlington? Today, Arlington serves as the country's most prestigious military cemetery. If you've ever been to Abe Lincoln National Cemetery near Joliet, Arlington Cemetery is like that, but even larger. And that is not any sort of coincidence. What happened when the war broke out and Virginia secedes, the Union sends people across into Virginia to seize this property because they don't want people like shelling, Washington, D.C. from Virginia. And they take hold of Lee's property in Arlington, the best military mind of the Civil War. And since he is going to be fighting against the North performs this very sort of nasty choice of they take Lee's property and his farm, his plantation, and turn it into this military cemetery. So Lee, who was in consideration to lead the Union Army, left with Virginia, and his farm, Arlington, becomes a national cemetery. And the idea was that Lee could never return back to his home again without seeing all these Union soldiers that he was responsible for basically killing in battle. This is the scene of Arlington National Cemetery today. All of these veterans who served our country are not all from the Civil War, but literally it is graves of people who have served our country for miles and miles and acres. It serves as the tomb of the unknown soldier. It is the gravesite of several presidents, including President John F. Kennedy. And this All this land is now filled with gravestones, used to be Robert E. Lee's property, and it was really a punishment put upon him by the United States military for basically what they felt was betraying them. And they had some reason to be mad at Lee. When Robert E. Lee left with the state of Virginia, the North had a huge lack of leadership. President Lincoln is recognized as being one of the greatest statesmen who ever lived. However, he did not have very many skilled generals to back him up. Probably the most talented general from the last war was General Winfield Scott. He was old fuss and feathers, and he was still around when the Civil War happened, but at this point he was really old, and he was so fat that he could not ride a horse. And that was seen as unacceptable, that you could have some, giant fatty trying to lead him into battle, and he couldn't even mount a horse. And so Winfield Scott was too old and too fat to lead, although he will come up with a plan that is important. So much of the duty comes to General McClellan, who I often refer to as McChicken. This is probably not the fairest title, but he was very hesitant to go into battle. He doesn't want to engage the enemy, especially in the early phases of the war, maybe because McClellan was smart enough to realize just how deadly these battles would be. But that doesn't sit well with Lincoln, because Lincoln wants the war to be over quickly. He was of the belief that the longer these things drag out, the harder it would be to kind of unify the country. And so McClellan, wanting to prepare and train, did not sit well with Lincoln, and eventually Lincoln will sort of force the Union into battle against the South. And General McClellan will be in charge at certain points of this. However, McClellan doesn't last. He gets replaced, and he gets replaced with somebody else who creates more problems, and it's like a revolving door of generals for the North, and they can't find anybody proficient to lead them. One of the number one plans that the North implemented on the South was through Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers, created a plan that was known as the Anaconda Plan. And the Anaconda Plan had two purposes. One was to economically strangle the South by cutting off their trade and their ports. And two, it was meant to try to keep out any sort of foreign intervention in the war. There was a fear that the South, being the number one cotton producer in the world, could seek some sort of alliance with Great Britain or France, and that they would come to their side. But by sealing some of this stuff off, through naval blockade, the North was going to be able to stop that. And also, by sealing off the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, and all their ports along the east, that keeps the South from being able to buy weapons through exporting cotton. So this technique actually, really economically impacts the South and forces them into submission. The problem that Lincoln had with this plan is that it would take too long. Winfield Scott said that by using the Anaconda Plan and using it right, the war would last 4 to 5 years. And Lincoln thought that was completely unacceptable. He felt that the war should be over in months, which, strangely enough, the war takes probably 4 or 5 years, and the Anaconda Plan does kind of work. So General Scott was right. He was just delivering news Lincoln didn't really want to hear. Oh, notice how it starts in Washington, D.C., right? So you send your fleet out, you kind of capture all these ports, you move around. It also included like cutting off the Mississippi, and like a big snake, a python, anaconda, it was going to squeeze the South to death economically. So the first real battle of the Civil War is sometimes called Bull's Run or Manassas. Different historians call it by different names, so sometimes Northerners refer to it as Bull's Run and Southern historians refer to it as Manassas, but they are in reference to the first real battle. Now, the first actual battle was Fort Sumter, but Fort Sumter was just really a shelling for a couple hours and a surrender. Nobody died, so I almost view Fort Sumter as not counting as a battle, although it is something you should know. The first time that American troops, Union troops, fight Southern Confederate troops is Manassas or Bull's Run. And in this battle, Lincoln will force his army to attack. He basically gives the order that he wants the Northern soldiers to march out and start fighting the South. And people didn't really know how this would go down. So as the Union Army walked out of Washington, D.C., there were actually people who went to go watch, that there were spectators that were like, woo, let's go see a war, let's go see a battle, and they traveled with the army. They didn't realize exactly what they were in for. You know, it used to be from a safe distance, you could kind of watch an army or a battle, and it was kind of like going to a sporting event. But with the increase of range and artillery and the sheer number of casualties, these people were in for a really rude awakening. And in the battle, probably the most significant turning point is that when the battle starts up, it is just a bloodbath. You know, people are charging at each other. They are not prepared for the range of these weapons, and people are just getting mowed down like blades of grass. And at one point, the Confederates are considering a retreat, but one of their commanders, General Jackson, later known as Stonewall, basically brings in reinforcements, and they're able to fight off the Union. There's kind of a quote where this name develops from when they're considering running. They say, look at General Jackson. He's on his horse like a stone, just sitting there like a stone wall, right? He doesn't leave. He doesn't waver. And that causes the men to be inspired, and they stay, and they actually win the battlefield, and the Union has to retreat. So Stonewall Jackson got his nickname from the first Battle of Bull's Run. And people had a reason to run. It was bloody. There were, in a one-day battle, 5,000 people killed. That is, to put in perspective, the entire population of Coal City, roughly, right? 5,000 people. That was more people that died in one day in Manassas than died in the entire U.S. Revolutionary War. It was utterly staggering. You know, spectators couldn't believe the carnage that was inflicted. This battle showed a couple things. The South was inspired. It thought that it could actually win and it could fight the North. And the North was angered, you know, that they faced such a crippling defeat. And the last thing that it showed was that this war was not going to wrap up easily. Lincoln was under the belief that his forces could pretty much topple the South. You know, there's less than 200 miles or so between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the South. So the idea was, you know, the North goes to war with the South, they're going to capture the capital, it's going to fall, but not with battles like this. You know, it is a very, very bloody affair. Okay, so class, in this presentation, we talked about Civil War being the bloodiest. Give me 3 reasons why so many Americans died in the Civil War. Go. Right. Yes. And yes. At this point, I'm sure people said they're all Americans, the medical technology sucked, and they were fighting with outdated tactics with better weapons. What were some of these new weapons developed in the Civil War? Go. Revolvers, rifle barrels, the mini ball. Good. But grape shot artillery. Why was losing Virginia such a big deal? Lee, history, big state, right next to Washington, D.C. Arlington today is a national cemetery. And what connection does it have to the Civil War? It used to be the property of Robert E. Lee. What was the Anaconda Plan, and how did they intend to use it to defeat the South, class? Keywords you're looking for are a naval blockade. And finally, what did Bull's Run indicate to people about the Civil War? That would be that the war was going to be a long one. Okay, so that is my lecture on the first battles and why so many people died in the American Civil War. I will show a video from America, the Story of Us, that talks about the mini ball and shows you some footage of Sawbones to kind of drive home this point. There will be a quiz that goes with this lesson, so hopefully you took some notes. You may use those notes on the quiz. Okay, I will see you next time. Mr. Bear, out.